have a bank statement in front of me right now, not on a screen, printed. 43 pages, held together at the corner with a binder clip I took from the kitchen junk drawer because I couldn't find a stapler and I was shaking too badly to look for one. The paper has a coffee ring on page 7 and a small smear of something I think was formula on the bottom of page 31. Because my daughter was 3 days old when I first sat down with this document, and I was not a person who had slept. I was not a person who had eaten. I was a person who had just given birth and was sitting in a rocking chair at 2 in the morning in a house that suddenly did not feel like it belonged to me, reading numbers that told a story I had not been present for. The account the statement belonged to was opened in my name. Every dollar deposited into it had come from a trust established by my grandfather before he died. A trust he spent the last 4 years of his life building specifically so that I would have security. He told me once, over the phone, that he never wanted me to have to ask anyone for anything. Those were his words, not anyone. He had watched my mother struggle her entire adult life, and he had decided, methodically and quietly, the way he did everything, that it would end with her, that I would be different. The total value of the trust when it transferred to me 2 weeks after my grandfather's funeral was $8,400,000. The balance on that statement, the one with the coffee ring and the formula smear, was $11,200.14. I want to take you back to the beginning, not because I need you to understand how I could have missed it. I've made my peace with that, or I'm still making it, which is not the same thing, but it is close enough for now. I need to start at the beginning because the way something ends only makes sense when you can see where it started. And this story started in a way that felt, at the time, like the best thing that had ever happened to me. My name is not important. What is important is this. I was 31 years old, I lived in a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest, I worked as a licensing coordinator for a regional architecture firm, and I had what I would have described, without hesitation, as a genuinely good life. Not extravagant, not charmed, good. I owned a reliable car. I had friends I'd had since college. I made $47,000 a year, which was enough in a city that hadn't yet been fully consumed by tech money, and I had a savings account with about $14,000 in it that I had built by not spending money on things I didn't need. I paid my own rent. I paid my own bills. I was not the kind of person who expected anything to be handed to her. That matters. I want you to know that, because the version of this story where I was naive or sheltered or waiting to be rescued is not accurate, and accuracy matters to me now more than it ever did before. I met Declan at a wedding in September. Not my wedding. A college friend's wedding, outdoor ceremony, outdoor reception. The kind of September evening where it's still warm enough to stand on a lawn in a dress without being cold, but cool enough that the air smells like something ending. He was the groom's cousin, in from Portland for the weekend, and he was funny in a way that didn't seem like it was trying to be. He made a joke during cocktail hour that I still remember, and I remember it because it was specific and self-deprecating in equal measure. And men who are self-deprecating without being pathetic are rarer than they should be. We talked for 4 hours. I missed the first dance. I missed the cake cutting. My friend Claire found me at a table near the bar at 9:30 and looked at me the way you look at someone who has clearly wandered somewhere interesting without a map. She said, "You're glowing," and I told her that was a ridiculous thing to say about a grown woman, and she shrugged and walked away because she knew me well enough to know I was pleased. Declan worked in commercial real estate. Project development, specifically, he evaluated potential acquisitions for a mid-sized development firm based in Portland and traveled frequently to scout sites in secondary markets. This explained the travel. It explained the phone calls he sometimes had to take during dinner. It explained the weeks when he was hard to reach and the weekends when he'd be tired in a way that had nothing to do with me. I'm not saying I accepted these things without noticing them. I'm saying they fit a coherent story about who he was, and the story was specific enough that it never required me to look for another one. We dated for 11 months before he moved in. We were engaged 8 months after that. The engagement was at a restaurant, private, no audience, no performance, which was exactly what I had always wanted and which I took at the time as evidence that he knew me. He did know me. That is the part that still costs me something to say out loud. He knew me. He just used it differently than I thought. My grandfather died 14 months into our relationship, 4 months before our wedding. He was 86. It was not sudden. He had been declining for 2 years, and he had handled it the way he handled everything, with logistics and very little sentiment. He had already met Declan twice. He had been polite. He had asked Declan exactly 3 questions about his work, listened to the answers without expression, and then moved on to other subjects. I thought nothing of it. My grandfather was reserved with everyone except me. The trust transfer happened 8 weeks after the funeral. The attorney handling the estate, a woman named Patricia who had worked with my grandfather for 20 years and who wore the same style of reading glasses he had, which I noticed and said nothing about, explained the structure of the trust to me in her office on a Thursday afternoon. The principal had been invested conservatively over 4 years. The transfer amount after estate processing was $8,400,000. I sat in that chair and felt something I don't have an accurate word for. Not happy, not relieved, something quieter than that and heavier. My grandfather had done this without telling me the scope of it, without asking for acknowledgement, without framing it as a gift because he would have found that sentimental, and he was not sentimental. He just did it the way he always did things because he had decided it needed to be done. I did not tell Declan the amount immediately. I told him there was a trust, that it was substantial, and that I was still working through the details. This was true. I needed time with it before it became something we talked about. I needed to feel like it was mine before it became ours. We were married 6 weeks later. I moved the trust funds into a joint account 17 days after the wedding because we were building a life, and I believed, with the specific confidence of a person who has never been deceived by someone she loved. That building a life meant sharing the materials you built it with. That was the decision, right there. 17 days after the ceremony, in a bank office with beige carpeting and a bowl of hard candies on the desk, I signed my name on a form that added Declan's name to the account. The account manager, a man in his 50s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, said, "Congratulations on the marriage," and handed me a pen. I said thank you. I used the pen. I didn't know then what I was signing over. I know now. 43 pages of it, with a coffee ring on page 7 and a formula smear on page 31. Sitting in a rocking chair at 2 in the morning with a 3-day-old daughter on my chest, and a number on the last page that had $11,000 where 8 million used to be. That's where this story starts, not at the end. At the beginning, in September, on a lawn that smelled like something ending. I just didn't know yet what it was. The first time I noticed something, I told myself I was tired. That is the sentence I have returned to more than any other in the past 2 years. Not because it excuses anything, because it is true, and because it reveals something about the specific way this kind of deception works. It doesn't happen when you are sharp and rested and paying close attention. It happens in the margins. In the moments when you are already carrying something else, and there is simply not enough room to carry one more thing. We had been married for 4 months when I noticed the first thing. I was looking for a receipt. We were disputing a charge on a credit card. Something routine, $42 from a restaurant neither of us remembered going to, and I went into Declan's email on our shared laptop to search for a confirmation number. He had given me the password himself months earlier when I needed to look something up while he was driving. The inbox loaded and I typed the restaurant name into the search bar, and while I was waiting I saw, at the top of the unread folder, an email from a financial institution I didn't recognize. The subject line said, "Your transfer of $47,000 has been initiated." I stared at it for 4 seconds, maybe 5. I did not open it. I told myself it was probably a work account. Declan's job involved property acquisition and development financing. He managed budgets that moved money in amounts like that regularly. I had heard him talk about wire transfers and escrow accounts and earnest money deposits with the casual fluency of someone who spent their days swimming in large numbers, and $47,000 in that context was not alarming. It was Tuesday morning vocabulary. I found the restaurant receipt. I closed the laptop. I reported the charge as fraudulent and got our $42 back. I did not mention the email. This is the part of the story where I understand now that I made a choice, not a dramatic choice, not a choice I was even fully aware I was making. But I looked at something that did not fit and I found a frame that made it fit, and I put it in that frame and I moved on. That is how it works, not ignorance, not stupidity. A series of small, reasonable seeming decisions to accept the explanation that cost the least. 3 weeks after that, Declan told me he wanted to refinance the house. We had bought the house 8 months earlier, 4 months before we married, using a down payment that came from my trust, $320,000. The house was worth, at purchase, $1,100,000. It was a craftsman-style home in a neighborhood that had appreciated steadily for a decade, close enough to the city that I could commute and far enough out that the yard was real and the neighbors were not on top of us. I loved that house. I want to be precise about that because it matters later. I loved it not because it was expensive, but because it felt like a place where a life could actually happen. It had a room I turned into a home office and a back porch where I drank coffee on weekend mornings, and a kitchen with a window over the sink that looked out at a row of old Douglas firs. Declan said refinancing made sense because rates had shifted and we could lower our monthly payment and free up cash flow. He said a contact of his at a lending firm had flagged it as a good window. He had done the preliminary math. It would save us around $800 a month. I said that sounded reasonable. He handled the paperwork. I signed where he told me to sign. The documents were dense and I was working long hours that month. We were in the middle of a large project at the firm and I was managing 3 contractor relationships simultaneously, and I trusted him to have read what I was signing. He was the one who worked in real estate. He was the one who understood how these instruments worked. I reviewed the first 2 pages of the refinance documents carefully and skimmed the rest. I did not notice that the refinance included a cash-out provision for $250,000. That money went somewhere. I did not know where yet because I was not looking. The second thing I noticed came 6 months after the first. I was pregnant by then, 12 weeks, still in the window where I was telling almost no one, still in the window where I woke up at 4:30 most mornings and lay still in the dark waiting for the nausea to pass. I had been checking the joint account more frequently since getting pregnant because the pregnancy had made me think about money in a way I hadn't let myself before, about what we had and what we would need and what kind of margin existed between those 2 things. One morning, I logged in and the balance was lower than I expected. Not dramatically lower. $46,000 lower than it had been 11 days earlier. I went through the transaction history and found it. A transfer out to an account labeled only with a routing number and a reference code I didn't recognize. I asked Declan about it that evening, calmly. I was always calm when I asked him things. I did not come in with accusations. I came in with questions because I believed that was fair and because I had no evidence of anything except a number that had moved somewhere I couldn't immediately account for. He explained it without hesitation. He said it was a capital call, an investment vehicle he had set up before we married, a small partnership with 2 colleagues, and that the partnership occasionally required additional capital contributions when acquisition opportunities arose. He said he'd mentioned it to me before, and maybe he had, because I could not say with certainty that he hadn't. He said the money would be back within 60 to 90 days with a return. He was patient when he explained it. Not overpatient, not the practiced patience of someone reciting a prepared answer. Just steady, like a person explaining something that is genuinely not complicated. I said okay. He kissed me on the forehead and asked how I was feeling, and I told him the nausea was a little better today, which was true, and we had dinner and watched something on television television, and I fell asleep on the couch, and he woke me up gently at 10:30 and walked me to bed. The $46,000 did not come back in 60 days. It did not come back in 90. I noted this. I made a private mental note of it with the same quiet filing cabinet part of my brain that had noted the email subject line 8 months earlier, and I told myself that investment timelines shift, that capital calls don't always resolve on schedule, that this was not the kind of thing worth pushing on when I was 20 weeks pregnant and we were teeting along well, and the house still smelled like a Douglas firs on a rainy day. The third thing was smaller than the first two, which is the thing about warning signs, they don't necessarily escalate in size. Sometimes they get smaller. Sometimes the person doing the deceiving gets more careful as they get more confident, and the signals get quieter and harder to read, and the fact that you haven't said anything yet makes it harder to say something now, because you would have to explain why you waited. 6 weeks before my due date, I was going through a bag in the front closet looking for my good umbrella. I found, tucked behind a box of tax documents we had never unpacked from the move, a manila envelope with my name on it, not Declan's handwriting, someone else's. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a deed, not our deed. A deed for a property at an address in Scottsdale, Arizona that I had never heard of, in a development community I had never heard of, listing me and Declan as joint owners. A house in Arizona, purchased 11 months earlier for $430,000. I did not know we owned a house in Arizona. I had not signed anything that I remembered signing. I did not know anyone in Scottsdale. I had never been to Scottsdale. I put the envelope back where I found it. I did not find my umbrella. I stood in the hallway for a long moment with my hands flat against my stomach, the instinctive, wordless gesture that pregnant women make when something scares them, as if the body knows before the mind does that it needs to protect something. I went back to the kitchen. I made tea. I sat down. I told myself there was an explanation. I told myself I would ask him about it when the timing felt right. The timing never felt right, because 3 days after I found that envelope, I went into labor, and for a while the world narrowed to something so immediate and physical and real that there was no room in it for manila envelopes or routing numbers or the quiet arithmetic of things that didn't add up. And then my daughter was born. And then, 3 days after that, I couldn't sleep, and I found myself in the rocking chair with a bank statement on my lap, and the timing stopped mattering entirely. The bank statement, I found that night was not something I went looking for. That is important. I was not suspicious in a focused, investigative way. I was not a woman who had been building a case. I was a woman who had given birth 72 hours earlier, who was running on fragments of sleep, whose body was doing things bodies do after labor that nobody fully prepares you for, and who got up at 2 in the morning because my daughter had woken and then gone back down, and I was too wired and too sore to follow her. I went to the kitchen. I made chamomile tea I didn't drink. I sat in the rocking chair. We had moved into the living room during the last weeks of my pregnancy, and because I had nothing else to do with my hands, I opened the laptop on the side table. I was going to look at pictures, baby photos from the hospital that my friend Claire had texted me, or the ones my mother had taken in the recovery room that I hadn't fully gone through yet. That was all. That was the entire scope of my intention at 2 in the morning on day 3 of my daughter's life. Instead, the browser opened to the last tab Declan had been using. He had been on the laptop that afternoon while I was napping. The tab that loaded was our joint bank account, the account the trust funds had been deposited into 19 months earlier, the account that held what remained of my grandfather's $8,400,000. The balance on the screen was $11,200.14. I remember the specific quality of the silence in that room. My daughter was asleep in the bassinet 6 feet away. The furnace was running. Outside, it was raining the way it rains in the Pacific Northwest in November, not dramatically, just persistently, the way water does when it has nowhere better to be. I looked at the number on the screen, and I did not move for a long time. Then I started clicking. I pulled up the full transaction history. The account allowed me to see 24 months back, and I went to the beginning and I read forward, transaction by transaction, the way you read something when you already know it is going to be bad and you are steeling yourself for the specific shape of how bad. What I found was not chaos. That was the first thing that struck me. Even then, even in that state, it was not chaotic. It was organized. It was deliberate. It was the financial record of someone who had been moving money with intention and consistency for the better part of 2 years, in amounts large enough to matter and varied enough not to trigger automatic flags. Transfers out, some to the account I now recognized as the one from that email subject line 19 months ago, the $47,000 transfer I had told myself was a work account. That account had received, across 14 separate transactions, a total of $1,230,000. Transfers to a second account I had never seen, 11 transactions, $890,000. A wire transfer, single occurrence, to an international routing number, $600,000. Dated 4 months after our wedding, 3 days after I had told Declan I was pregnant for the first time, a pregnancy that ended in miscarriage at 9 weeks, and during which I had been so consumed by grief and physical recovery that I had not looked at a bank statement for 2 months. The timing of that wire was not an accident. I understand that now in a way I couldn't have understood it then, sitting in that chair at 2 in the morning. He had watched me go through something that took all of my attention and used the window. I kept reading. The cash-out refinance I had signed, the one that freed up $250,000 in equity from our house. Those funds had been deposited directly into the second account, not the joint account, not anywhere I could see from the statements I had access to. I had signed a document that rooted $250,000 away from our shared assets, and I had done it because he had handed me a pen and I had trusted the hand that held it out. The Scottsdale property. I searched for it in the transaction history. I found the purchase wired out in 2 installments, $215,000 in one transfer, $220,000 in another, 8 days apart, 14 months ago. Joint owners on the deed, my name included, but the funds drawn entirely from the trust account I had moved into his reach 19 months prior. He had bought a house in Arizona with my grandfather's money and put my name on it, which I now understand was not generosity. It was architecture. It meant that if I ever found the deed, I would see my own name and be more likely to assume I had simply forgotten signing something, and less likely to understand that I had been used as a co-signer without my knowledge on a transaction I was never told was happening. I sat with the laptop until 4:15 in the morning. My daughter woke once, at 3, and I fed her in that chair with the laptop still open beside me, its screen casting a pale light across the transaction history, and I read while she nursed and she fell back asleep against my chest and I kept reading. By the time the sky outside began its slow gray shift toward morning, I had a rough total. I am not a forensic accountant. I was working from a consumer banking interface with a 24-month window, and I knew there were accounts I couldn't see and transfers I couldn't trace from where I was sitting. But what I could account for, in that one account, in that one window, was approximately $8,170,000 moved out in a pattern that was consistent, varied, and deliberate. I closed the laptop. I did not wake Declan. I did not cry, which surprised me. I had cried at things that mattered far less than this, at a sad commercial once, at the ending of a book, at my grandfather's funeral, when I had promised myself I wouldn't. But sitting in that chair at 4:15 in the morning, with my 3-day-old daughter breathing against my collarbone, and the specific knowledge of what had been done to me settling into my chest like something physical, I did not cry. I made a list instead. In my head first, then on my phone in the Notes app, typed with one thumb while I held my daughter with the other arm. Attorney, my own account, copies of everything. The deed, Patricia. Patricia was my grandfather's estate attorney. The woman with the reading glasses. I had not spoken to her since the trust transfer closed 14 months ago, but I had her card in a folder in my home office, and I knew, with the specific clarity of someone whose mind has just been stripped of everything except what is actually true, that she was the first call I needed to make when the sun came up. But that was still 2 hours away. So I sat, I held my daughter, I listened to the rain, and I thought about my grandfather, about the 4 years he had spent building that trust, about what he had said on the phone about never wanting me to ask anyone for anything, about the 3 questions he had asked Declan, and the expression he had worn while listening to the answers. An expression I had read as reserve, as his baseline neutrality with anyone who wasn't me. I sat with a different reading of it now, the kind of reading that only becomes available after the fact, when the thing that was obscured is finally visible. He hadn't trusted him, he just hadn't told me, because he loved me and he believed I was capable, and he did not want to be the person who stood between me and a choice I had made. He built the trust anyway, put my name on it alone, structured it as carefully as he knew how, and then he died, and I moved the money into a joint account 17 days after the wedding, and undid in an afternoon what he had spent 4 years building. I did not know yet what was coming. The attorney, the investigation, the specific legal and financial machinery that would eventually grind into motion. I did not know how long it would take, or what it would cost, or what I would find when people with actual forensic training started pulling on the threads I had found with one hand and a phone at 4 in the morning. What I knew was this: the person sleeping in the other room had studied me for 3 years. He had learned what I trusted and what I dismissed, and what I was too tired or too pregnant or too grieving to look at directly. He had used the architecture of a marriage, the joint account, the co-signed deed, the refinance documents I had skimmed, to move my grandfather's money through a series of accounts I had no visibility into. And he had done it so carefully and so consistently that the last line of the statement was not an accident or a collapse or a loss. It was a completion. He had finished what he started. And now, finally, so was I called Patricia at 7:58 in the morning. I know the time because I looked at my phone before I dialed, and I made a deliberate decision that 7:58 was close enough to 8 o'clock that I was not calling an attorney before business hours. I was calling an attorney the moment business hours were functionally underway. My daughter was in the bassinet. Declan was still asleep. I had moved to the back porch with the door pulled shut behind me, standing in my robe in 41-degree November air, because I needed to not be heard and I needed to not be inside. Patricia answered on the 3rd ring. I said, "This is your client's granddaughter. I need to talk to you about the trust." She said, "I'll clear my 9 o'clock. Can you come in at 9:30? That was it. No questions. No preamble. I have thought about that response many times since, the speed of it, the complete absence of surprise, and I think she had been waiting for a version of this call for longer than I knew. I told Declan I had a postpartum checkup. He was half awake, warm, unbothered. He said he'd watch the baby. He kissed me on the temple. I drove to Patricia's office with a printed bank statement folded in my bag, 43 pages, soft at the folds. The one I had printed at 6:15 that morning, while Declan slept and my daughter slept and the house held its breath. And I sat across from a woman who had known my grandfather for 20 years, and I put the statement on her desk and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me 3 questions in sequence, each one building on the last, in the precise and unhurried way of someone who already has a framework and is confirming where the facts land inside it. She asked about the date the funds were moved to the joint account. She asked whether I had signed the cash-out refinance documents in person, or whether any signatures had been obtained elsewhere, by email, by DocuSign, by anything I might not have been physically present for. She asked whether I knew if Declan had ever had access to the account before we married. I answered each one. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk and said, "I want you to hear this clearly. What you are describing is not a marital dispute over finances. What you are describing is wire fraud and possibly forgery, and I need you to not go home home and confront him before we have spoken to a litigator who handles exactly this. Wire fraud? I had known the word before that morning. I had not known, until that morning, that it was a word that applied to my life. Patricia referred me to an attorney named Marcus Webb, a litigator who specialized in financial fraud with a secondary focus on marital asset dissipation. I had an appointment with him the following morning. In the 22 hours between Patricia's office and Marcus's office, I did 4 things. I opened a new checking account at a different bank entirely, in my name only, with a branch that was not the one Declan and I used. I transferred the remaining $11,200 into it, which I had legal right to do as a joint account holder. I photographed every document I could find in my home office: the deed to the Scottsdale property, the refinance paperwork, 3 years of tax returns Declan had filed jointly, a folder of investment statements I had never fully examined, and I called my mother and told her, in the flattest voice I had available, that I needed her to come stay with me and that I would explain when she arrived, and that she should not ask Declan anything when she got there. Mimo, the drove 4 hours. She arrived at 2 in the afternoon, walked through the door, took one look at my face, and did not ask a single question. She picked up my daughter and took her to the living room, and I went upstairs and lay on the bed in the spare room for 45 minutes and stared at the ceiling. Marcus Webb's office was downtown, 14th floor, a corner office with a view of the river that I remember with odd clarity, the gray of the water and the gray of the sky meeting at a line I kept looking at while he talked. He was methodical in a way that felt different from Patricia's methodical. Patricia was careful. Marcus was systematic. He went through my documents, asked his questions, made notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting I couldn't read from where I sat, and at the end he looked up and said, "Based on what you've shown me, the account activity you can document alone represents fraudulent transfer of trust assets. The forgery question on the refinance is something we'll need a document examiner for. The Scottsdale property is actually useful to you. His name is on that deed too, which means we can move to freeze it before he does anything with it." I asked him how long this would take. He said, "That depends on how much he's hidden and how cooperative he decides to be. But you should know, people who do this kind of thing this carefully are rarely cooperative." He was right about that. I went home that evening. My mother was in the kitchen making dinner. Declan was at the table with my daughter on his lap, doing the thing he sometimes did where he talked to her in a low, narrating voice about whatever was in front of him. He was describing the salt shaker to her, its weight, its material, the way light moved through it, and for a single fractured second, I stood in the doorway and felt the full weight of what it means to look at a person and see 2 completely different things at once. The man holding my daughter, the routing numbers on the transaction history. I sat down, I ate dinner. I said normal things. I had decided, on Marcus's advice, not to confront Declan yet, not until the freeze on the Scottsdale property was in motion, and not until we had a forensic accountant engaged to begin tracing the full scope of the transfers. Confronting him before that, Marcus explained, was a risk, not a physical risk. He was not worried about that specifically, and neither was I, because Declan was not a violent person. He was a methodical one. And methodical people, when they realize the game has changed, move fast. I waited 11 days. On the 12th day, the Scottsdale property freeze was in place. The forensic accountant, a woman named Dr. Renata Solis, who had testified in federal fraud cases and who looked at my transaction history with the focused absence of expression of someone reading a language she knows fluently, had completed her preliminary review, and Marcus had filed the initial complaint with both the State Attorney General's office and the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. The wire transfers across state lines, he explained, triggered federal jurisdiction. The $600,000 international wire specifically was exactly the kind of transaction federal financial crimes units existed to pursue. On the evening of the 12th day, I asked my mother to take my daughter for a drive. I waited until I heard the car back out of the driveway. Then I went to the kitchen, where Declan was making coffee, and I put a single piece of paper on the counter in front of him. It was a printout of the forensic accountant's preliminary findings. 1 page, 12-line items. Total documented outflow, $8,163,000. He looked at it for a long time, long enough that the coffee finished brewing, and neither of us moved to pour it. Then he said, "Where did you get this?" Not a question, a flat sentence, the voice of someone recalibrating. I said, "It doesn't matter where I got it. What matters is that the FBI has a copy." The silence after that was different from the 2 in the morning silence, different from the porch silence, different from any silence I had sat in during the previous 12 days. It had a texture to it, a density, like something that had been held under pressure for a long time and had just been released. He did not deny it. He did not perform confusion or outrage or the kind of loud, misdirecting disbelief I had half prepared myself for. He sat down at the kitchen table and he looked at his hands and he said, very quietly, "I was going to put it back." That was it. The full explanation. 19 months, $8 million, 3 real estate transactions, 14 wire transfers, 2 shell accounts, 1 international wire routed through a financial institution in Malta, a cash-out refinance I had signed while trusting the hand that held out the pen. I was going to put it back. I looked at him for a moment, at the man I had talked to for 4 hours at a wedding in September, at the man who had described a salt shaker to my daughter in a low, patient voice. I said, "Get out of my house." He left that night. He did not take much. He did not argue. I think, by then, he understood that arguing was not something that was available to him anymore. I stood at the kitchen window after the door closed, looking out at the row of Douglas firs in the dark, and I thought about my grandfather, and about the pen, and about what precision actually looks like when it is finally yours. Then I went to find my daughter. The legal process took 14 months from start to resolution. I want to be honest about that number because I have watched enough content in this format to know that people often often compress the timeline, make it sound like the wheels of justice turn faster than they do, because a faster resolution is more satisfying to hear. 14 months is not fast. It is 14 months of depositions and forensic accounting reports and attorneys' fees and court dates that got continued and rescheduled and continued again. 14 months of co-parenting logistics with a man I was suing. 14 months of my daughter growing from a newborn into a person who could sit up and then crawl and then pull herself to standing, while the machinery of the law moved at the speed the law moves. But it moved. Dr. Renata Solis' full forensic accounting report, completed 8 weeks after my initial meeting with Marcus, documented the complete picture of what Declan had done. The 2 accounts I had identified from the transaction history were the visible layer. Beneath them were 3 additional entities, 2 LLCs incorporated in Delaware, 1 in Wyoming, that had been used as pass-throughs. The money did not simply disappear into his personal accounts. It moved through a structure that was designed to create distance between the original source and the final destination. And that structure had been set up 8 months before we married, 8 months before the wedding, 4 months after we got engaged, while I was in our apartment making coffee and thinking about how good things were. The total documented outflow, per Dr. Solis' report, was $8,312,000. The remaining $88,000 had been spent on the Scottsdale property's carrying costs, on a car I had never seen, on what the report described as lifestyle expenditure across a period of 19 months. The federal investigation moved on a parallel track to the civil case Marcus was building. Declan was charged federally with wire fraud and money laundering in the 7th month after I filed. His attorney, and he had a very good one, which told me something about where at least some of the money had gone, negotiated a plea agreement that included full financial disclosure as a condition. Full disclosure meant that the LLC structures had to be unwound and their assets identified. It meant the international wire to Malta had to be traced, which it was, to an account in his name at a private bank that primarily served non-resident clients. It meant the $230,000 sitting in that account came back into the recoverable pool. I want to be clear about what recovery looked like, because the number I am about to give you is not the same as the number that was taken. The Scottsdale property was sold during the proceedings, court-ordered liquidation, and returned $418,000 after fees. The Delaware and Wyoming LLCs, unwound, yielded approximately $1,090,000 in recoverable assets. The Malta account, $230,000. Garnishment of Declan's future earnings was built into the civil judgment, which means that recovery is ongoing in amounts that will take years to accumulate. The house, our house, the craftsman with the Douglas firs, was awarded to me outright in the divorce settlement. Its equity restored to its pre-refinance value through the judgment. Total recovered to date, 20 months after that night in the rocking chair, approximately $2,100,000 of the $8,312,000 that was taken. I am not going to tell you that $2 million feels like enough. It does not. It is not the number my grandfather spent 4 years building, and it is not the number that was on that account before I signed my name on a form with a pen a bank manager handed me 17 days after my wedding. The remaining $6 million exists somewhere in a structure of offshore positioning and deliberate asset concealment that will take years and considerable additional legal resources to pursue, and I am pursuing it, and that is all I will say about that for now. What I will tell you is what I have instead. I have the house. I have rebuilt a cash position from my salary and D from a settlement that covered a portion of my legal fees. I have a financial advisor, a woman named Teresa, who was referred to me by Patricia, and who I met with for the first time when my daughter was 5 months old, and who has looked at me with the specific patience of someone who has sat across from people in exactly this situation before, and understands that what they need first is not a strategy, it is a witness. I have a trust account for my daughter, structured by Patricia, that I set up the month the divorce was finalized. I have a home office in the room I always used as a home office, and a back porch where I drink coffee on weekend mornings, and a kitchen with a window over the sink that looks out at the Douglas firs, and my daughter, who is 14 months old and who pulls herself to standing against the coffee table and looks very pleased with herself every single time. I have the 43-page bank statement. Still, I kept it. It is in a folder in my filing cabinet, behind the tab labeled with the year, soft at the folds, coffee ring on page 7. I have kept it not as a wound to return to, but as a record. Evidence that something happened and that I was present for it, and that I did not look away once I finally looked. Here is the thing I want to leave you with, and I have thought carefully about how to say it because I do not want it to sound like a lesson, because I do not think this is a story about a lesson. Lessons imply that if you had simply done something differently, you would have been safe. That is not what I believe. What I believe is this: he did not succeed because I was careless. He succeeded because he was patient and I was trusting, and he spent 3 years learning exactly how those two things fit together. The warning signs were real. I saw them. I filed them in a drawer labeled reasonable explanation, and I moved on, because the alternative, to believe that the person I had chosen to build a life with was systematically dismantling that life while I was busy living it, was a cost my mind was not ready to pay. That is not weakness. That is what it costs to love someone without reservation. And the fact that he used that cost against me does not mean the loving was wrong. What I know now, that I did not know before, is the specific weight of a document in your hands, the specific clarity that comes from reading something you cannot explain away, in the specific silence of 2 in the morning, with the specific knowledge that you are the only person who is going to fix this. There is something that becomes available in that moment that was not available before. Not strength, exactly. Something quieter than that and more permanent. My grandfather called it precision. I think he was right.